Taking Stock on News Talk.
Thanks to Skillnet Ireland, driving business success through innovative training and upskilling.
We're joined now by Ronan Dunn, partner and head of the Competition, EU and State Aid Law team at Philip Lee. Ronan, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Gavin.
And it's another week and another European Commission probe of a big US tech company. This time it's Google. You might briefly just outline some of the concerns that the Commission has.
Yes, absolutely. Fourth time of asking for Google in this instance, Gavin. It's the fourth investigation. The three previous investigations led to over 8 billion euros of fines. But this time around, what the European Commission is probing is Google's ad tech business. So effectively, it's looking at an alleged abuse by Google in terms of favouring its own online display advertising technology services over those of third parties, effectively.
Yeah, so the idea is you want to put an ad on YouTube or something which Google owns, and Google would say, yeah, you can do that, but you got to use one of our particular tools rather than one of our competitors.
Absolutely, this is it. And in fact, the investigation has a number of other elements to it as well. So it seems that the European Commission is trying to take as broad an approach as possible to capture a number of different items which are relevant to online advertising.
And there's sort of a similar probe into Amazon as well, and it's basically to do with Amazon hosting sort of third-party retailers on the Amazon website, and then they can sort of look at the data, what's doing well for these third parties, what isn't, and they can use that data to inform maybe their own strategy in terms of what they're going to sell.
Exactly, Gavin. Amazon controls all of the levels of the advertising supply chain. So this is the reason why there's a probe into its activities at the moment. And similarly, the European Commission is now going to look at Google in that context. The issue with a lot of these big tech businesses is data is the new oil. And if you control all of the different levels, you can control the pricing of your own products then in terms of competing against others. And that's where the European Commission is concerned, particularly obviously relevant to Amazon in the context of that investigation, which was opened up last year.
Yeah, and this is this concept of abuse of a dominant position, it's called. Just tell us a bit about that. What does one need to be able to show to prove that this breach of the law has been committed?
So abuse of a dominant position is a concept under EU law, which we've also replicated then in the Irish context for specific, I suppose, indigenous Irish issues as well. But effectively, what it is intended to consider is a business can act independently of its competitors and ultimately of its consumers in terms of how it prices its products. So that you are in a situation where if you can raise your products and consumers can't go anywhere else or there's no other real sources, well, that's the test. You would then be considered dominant in that type of a scenario. And we see this quite often with big tech. I mean, there's a similar investigation being run by the European Commission in relation to Apple's App Store and its pay practices. So we've got that running on at the same time as now the Google and the Amazon investigations. And the issue with this is that these businesses have often a captive audience, so they are inherently dominant in terms of their consumers.
My instinct kind of is fair play, well done to these guys. You know, they have good businesses that have done really well. You know, why do you think she's so concerned about this? Do you think her concerns have merit? This when I say she, of course, I mean the Competition Commissioner Margrethe Vestager, who is spearheading these probes.
Well, I think at a societal level, if we allow businesses to be dominant and ultimately to abuse that dominance, it stifles innovation. Invariably, you get more innovation and I suppose greater technical developments from allowing third parties to compete. And I suppose this has been historically over the years what's happened in any number of different businesses. Over time, monopolies, the economic theory will show that they become stagnant and have no longer a need to innovate. So while obviously these tech companies have done fantastically well to create their own position, if we allow them to become monopolies and never have any real challenge, well, I think ultimately consumers will pay the price because there will be a stifling of competition. And that's very much Commissioner Vestager's view on the issue since she's been in the role of Competition Commissioner.
And I suppose what makes it so challenging for these businesses is being a monopoly is kind of in their essence. I mean, not so much with the Google ad example, but certainly with Facebook, there's a probe into them as well, and Amazon. The network effect, as it's called, is very powerful. So, the more people who use them, the better they are. Obviously, the more ordinary individuals who are on Facebook, the more retailers who are on Amazon, the better they are for consumers.
That's true, and I suppose network effects is important in that context. But I think what the European Commission, is looking to do is not lose sight of the fact that for the other startups that are out there, for the other competitors, and that the marketplace is large enough for them to compete as well. And we're looking at the tech industry, which is an exponential growth generally. So if we allow there to be a very delineated number of businesses which provide these services only, then we are ultimately stifling competition. So allow the market develop, yes, but where regulation or where enforcement is required, well, step in and do that as well.
What happens now then, Ronan? Obviously the probes have started, so what's going to happen over the next few months?
So I suppose in the context of Google in particular, I mean, this is the fourth time that Google has been investigated by the European Commission. And actually earlier this month, it was fined 220 million euros by the French Competition Authority for an abuse of dominance in the online advertising market in France. So I suppose this is a well-trodden path at this stage for Google. Ultimately, the question is whether they will look to reach some kind of a settlement with the European Commission to wrap this up quickly and move on, or whether the Commission will go through a full investigation. I suppose that's a $64 million question. I think what's probably more important than anything else in the background is the legislative developments that we're seeing at the EU level now, that the European Commission is bringing through with the European Parliament to ultimately look at allowing greater regulation over the big tech industry generally, so that we move away from having these continual cycle of abuse of dominance type investigations on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, because these fines, I mean, you mentioned this 220 million euro fine. Google will find that down the back of the couch. Presumably it's much more effective if you can say, look, we're making an order from now on. If somebody wants to display an ad on YouTube, you have to let them use whatever services provider they want, whether it's your own or some small software developer in Dublin.
Well, exactly, that's it. I mean, I appreciate that the French fine, in the grand scheme of things, even actually the 8 billion euros of fines for a business like Google, it's probably pocket change at the end of it all. But it sets precedential value that the European Commission can then rely on. And what we're seeing now in particular is actually, after a number of years of protectionist policies under President Trump, there is now a sea change happening in America as well. So I think the signal that sends at the EU level is we have a new Digital Markets Act and a new Digital Services Act being promulgated at the EU level, which will allow potentially for recidivists, for those businesses that continue to abuse dominance, ultimately, at a very worst case scenario, be broken up. And that's not something that I think would be taken lightly or would happen immediately. But it's intended to signal to what's described as the digital gatekeepers of the internet that changes are afoot at the regulatory level. So rather than have this cycle of investigation after investigation into different aspects of these different businesses, one will see greater emphasis on the GAFA, the Google, the Apple, the Facebooks, and Amazons, through regulatory intervention instead.
The idea of breaking them up, I mean, I was going to get onto that. I mean, could it really happen here in Europe if it wasn't done in America as well? How would that even work?
Very unlikely that it would happen in Europe. I mean, that's true because of the fact that these are American businesses that we're talking about. And if we were speaking, this time last year, Gavin, I would have said it's an absolute impossibility. But we've seen over the last number of weeks that actually there's been a series of antitrust bills introduced by the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives in the US, with bipartisan support, importantly, which actually speak to these very issues. They speak to potential divestment of certain elements of big tech businesses. So divestment, so it may be that, for a certain particular arm of a business could be divested. So it's something that I think 12 months ago, particularly under President Trump, it would not have been possible. But there's already bipartisan support for that at this stage in the States in terms of the new legislation that is coming down the tracks. And I think perhaps some of that might be coming out of COVID, this fear that regulators do not have enough information into algorithms, and there's all sorts of potentially third-party agendas that are being pushed through certain platforms that regulators need to have greater oversight of. So we are seeing a sea change in America, and I think that will influence then how obviously we proceed in the EU as well, because up until now, Commissioner Vestager has really led the vanguard, but the US is rowing in behind as well.
Our guest here on News Talk is Ronan Dunn, partner and head of the Competition, EU and State Aid Law team at Philip Lee. Ronan, if we just return to this probe into Google that's making the news this week, can I just clarify? Does she actually have? Does the Commission actually have the power at the moment to make that kind of order I mentioned earlier, to say, look, you from now on have to allow anyone to display an ad on YouTube using whatever services provider they want, whether it's yours in Google or somebody else?
Ultimately, if the competition analysis that will be done by the European Commission mandates that type of a fix, then yes, the Commission can do that. I suppose it's important to flag in that context that in two of the previous investigations in relation to the shopping search engine for Google and for the Android investigation, there were fixes, for want of a better word, imposed on Google. So basically behavioral type remedies that they had to impose, and they're currently being monitored by the European Commission. So the Commission does have power to levy more than fines. It says, we will levy a fine, but you must also remedy this situation by doing X, Y, and Z. So that is within the remit of the European Commission in this instance.
But I suppose the idea of increased regulation is you can sort of do that ab initio, Ronan, to use the legalese, rather than having to whack them after the fact.
Exactly. It's to get in early. And I mean, I think what we've seen is this is intended, regulation has been playing catch up. In particular, we've seen traditional news destroyed over the past decade. It's been eaten up by social media. So regulation is really playing catch up in that context. It's a bit of a blunt instrument, but it is preferable to having to go through investigation after investigation to get to where the European Commission wants to be for consumers and for rival businesses.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing we should bear in mind in this particular case is it's likely it's probably going to end up in the ECJ, is it?
Potentially, yes. Google, it's interesting, Google has not necessarily always appealed the European Commission's decisions. It accepted previous fines in an attempt to move on. So it's a little, I suppose that depends on the appetite of each of the big tech industries, or businesses that are being investigated. There has been a different risk appetite in that context. We've seen obviously Apple look to appeal and successfully, obviously, in the context of the tax issue through the European court system. But Google has not tended to take that approach.
Finally, then, I suppose moving away from your legal hat, Ronan, this is more of a question for you in your capacity as just an observer of this area. How do you think this is all going to play out? Are these companies ultimately going to be forced to break up in some way, or are they going to behave themselves before politicians, maybe decide this is what we got to do?
I think, at a personal level, I think we're at a point of no return in terms of the regulation piece, and I would assume that it will ultimately be regulation of big tech generally that will look to bring an end to the cycle of investigations from an abusive dominance perspective. So I think regulation is ultimately the way to go. We've been a bit behind in terms of playing catch up, but it's finally happening in the US and in the EU. So I think that will look to, in all likelihood, resolve the major concerns until the next form of technology. And we're starting into this cycle all over again.
Well, yes, indeed. That's one way of thinking about it. All right. Thanks very much for that, Ronan. That's Ronan Dunn, partner and head of the Competition, EU and State Aid Law team at Philip Lee. Thanks for being with us.
Many thanks, Gavin.
Taking Stock on News Talk.
Thanks to Skillnet Ireland, driving business success through innovative training and upskilling.